I was sentenced not in a courtroom, but in a hall designed to process weathered parchment and living bodies with equal indifference. The administratum building squatted at the center of the hive like a stone tumor, its windows narrow and stained with centuries of soot. Inside, the air was dry and sour, heavy with dust, candle smoke, and the faint chemical tang of preservation oils used on records that mattered more than people. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the place smelled older than memory itself. My boots echoed on the tiled floor as I joined the line, another obedient shape funneling toward a row of clerks who had not looked up in years. The summons had arrived that morning as a thin strip of vellum pushed under my hab door by an auto-scribe drone. It bore the red wax seal of authority, impressed so deeply it tore the fibers of the page. There was no explanation, no charge, only a time, a location, and the phrase for immediate transfer. I reread it until the words lost meaning, then folded it carefully and placed it inside my coat, as though politeness might save me. In the hive, paperwork was a kind of divination. Being named was safer than being noticed. I told myself it was an error. The administratum thrived on errors. I had survived others. The line moved with glacial inevitability. Ahead of me, a woman wept quietly, clutching a stack of forms like a rosary. Behind me, someone coughed wetly, each rasp echoing too loud in the vaulted chamber. The clerks sat behind high desks, their faces half obscured by cogitator screens and stacks of ledgers bound in cracked leather. Quills scratched continuously, a sound like insects gnawing at wood. Seals were pressed, stamps fell, and lives were refiled without comment. When a clerk's bell chimed, the next person stepped forward. There was no space for hesitation. The queue compressed like a living thing, urging us onward. When my turn came, I placed the summons on the desk with both hands. The clerk, pale, thin, augmetic lenses clicking softly where eyes should have been, did not look at me. He scanned the vellum, tapped a key, and waited as a printer coughed up a new strip of parchment. He read from it in a flat voice, reciting a designation code, a hive sector origin, and a date of birth that I barely recognized as my own. My name was spoken once, mispronounced, then never again. It was replaced by a number that felt heavier than any chain. No accusation. I asked, and hated myself for the tremor in my voice. The clerk paused, not to consider the question, but because his augmetic stuttered. He adjusted it with a practiced motion and continued reading. Somewhere behind him, a servo skull drifted, recording the transaction with dull red optics. The clerk slid the new document toward me. At the bottom, already stamped, were the words that hollowed me out: PL asset, transfer right. The wax was still warm. They weighed me next, herding me onto a metal platform that hummed beneath my boots. An attendant adjusted dials while murmuring figures to a scribe who inscribed them into a ledger thicker than my forearm. I was measured for height, limb length, chest expansion. My fingerprints were taken, each finger pressed into ink and rolled with mechanical care. They took a retinal scan, a blood sample, and a genetic scrap scraped painfully from the inside of my cheek. Every part of me was converted into data. I felt myself thinning, as though with each measurement something essential was being siphoned away. I tried again to speak. There's been a mistake. This time the attendant smiled, a small, pitying curve of the mouth. Mistakes are corrected, he said, and stamped another form. I was escorted to a side alcove where a robed functionary affixed an identification tag to my wrist. It bit into the skin, needles pricking as it synced with the system. I could feel it pulse, registering my existence in some distant archive. Above us, carved into the stone, were words worn smooth by time and reverence. Ignorance is a virtue. Compliance is survival. I wondered how many others had read them at this exact moment, feeling the same quiet terror settle into their bones. As they processed me, the queue never stopped moving. Lives slid past in my peripheral vision, each person stepping forward, being reduced, then ushered away through a door marked with a sigil I did not recognize. Somewhere to my left, a man shouted that he had already served his tithe, that he had children, that he was loyal. The clerks did not look up. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by the steady scratching of quills. When they were finished, a guard took my arm. His grip was firm but not cruel, practiced rather than angry. "Transfer corridor," he said, as if directing me to a transit platform. As we walked, I caught sight of a wall of filing cabinets stretching into the shadows, each drawer labeled with codes and dates. I understood then that I had been here before, in some sense, that my life had always been a potential entry, waiting to be reassigned. At the threshold of the corridor, the guard paused long enough to remove the tag from my wrist and replace it with a heavier band stamped with warning sigils. "Don't lose this," he said. "It's more important than you are." The doors slid shut behind me with a sound like finality. In the dim light beyond, I felt the last fragile protest inside me go quiet. Innocence, I realized, was not a defense. It was an administrative irrelevance. My fate had not been decided today. It had simply been filed. They did not take me to a cell the way a person imagines a cell. 4 walls, a cot, a lock you can stare at until it grows familiar. They took me downward, into the service intestines of the administratum, through corridors that were never meant for the public eye. The lift smelled of old machine grease and stale breath, its cage rattling as it descended. A lumen strip flickered overhead with the rhythm of a failing heart, turning the guard's face into alternating masks, human for a moment, then skull lit and dead the next. My wristband pinged softly at each security gate, and every time it did, I felt as though something inside me was being counted again. The underlevels were warmer, the air thicker, steam hissed from ruptured pipes, stitched together with prayer, scrolls and clamps. The walls sweated rust. When my shoulder brushed the metal, orange grit smeared on my sleeve like dried blood. Everything was damp and metallic, and beneath it all lingered the antiseptic sting of disinfectant, used too often to hide what could never be cleaned away. The hive above had a constant churn of noise, engines shouting, the distant hymns of shift changes, but down here the sound changed. It became a muffled, institutional hush punctuated by sudden mechanical shrieks, a door lock engaging, a buzzer, a servo motor coughing itself awake. We passed a shrine niche where a small candle burned behind wire mesh, its flame struggling in the stale air. A crude icon had been bolted above it, the sacred visage scratched into bronze and worn smooth by countless touches. The guard did not slow, but my eyes snagged on the scratched inscription beneath the icon. "Order is mercy." I tried to believe it, if only to keep my feet moving. At the end of the corridor, the architecture changed, less ceremonial stone, more bare ferrocrete reinforced with ribbed steel. My boots clanged on grated walkways slick with condensation. I heard voices ahead, not a chorus but a scattered, uneven murmur, as if the hive itself were whispering in its sleep. When the guard turned a corner and the holding area opened before me, I tasted bile. The cages were stacked in rows, like storage racks for meat. Metal bars, thick as my wrist, formed compartments just large enough for 6 or 7 bodies to crouch or stand. There were no bunks. The floor was grated, and beneath it ran a shallow channel where waste, liquid, solid, and everything in between, flowed sluggishly toward a drain that would eventually lead to somewhere even lower. In places, the channel had clogged, and the stench rose in a warm wave that hit the back of my throat. Urine, feces, sweat, cheap disinfectant, and something else, something coppery and faint. Like old blood soaked into fabric that never dries, lumen globes hung from the ceiling, but their light was the color of sickness, a jaundiced glow that made skin look bruised. Shadows clung to the corners of the room and to the spaces between the cages. In that light, everyone looked halfway to corpsehood already. The guard opened one cage with a key that was more a ritual object than a tool. The lock clicked with a sound I would come to recognize as the noise of fate being secured. He shoved me inside without ceremony. The bars slammed shut. I flinched at the sound, not because it was loud, but because it was final. There were already 5 men in the cage. They shifted to make room, moving like animals trained by pain. One sat with his back against the bars, knees drawn to his chest, rocking slightly. Another stood rigid, staring straight ahead as if he could see through the far wall into a better world. A third, broad-shouldered, with grime caked beneath his fingernails, looked me up and down with the detached assessment of someone judging whether a tool will break. "What did they say you did?" he asked. His voice was rough, but not cruel. It sounded like someone who had spent years breathing manufacturum dust. "I don't know," I answered, and the words tasted stupid as soon as I said them. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course you don't. In the cage to our left, someone was shouting, "I demand review! I demand a magistrate!" "I've paid my tithe." The voice rose and cracked, then rose again. The man clung to the bars with both hands, knuckles white, face slick with sweat. He was pleading to a ceiling that did not care. No one answered him. No clerk appeared with a correction stamp. The only response was the steady scratching of an auto, scribe somewhere in the shadows, recording the noise as a disturbance rather than a plea. A buzzer shrieked suddenly, sharp enough to make me wince. A slot opened in the wall opposite the cages, and a tray slid out with a series of bowls arranged on it. A servitor, once human, now a wheeled thing of flesh and metal, rolled along the line, stopping at each cage. Its face was a smooth mask, mouth sewn shut, with a single optic lens that clicked as it focused. It pushed a bowl through each cage's feeder slit with the mechanical patience of an assembly line. The broth inside was grey-brown and thin. The smell hit me first, copper and rot, like blood diluted with sewer water. Steam rose faintly, carrying a greasy film that clung to my nostrils. The men in my cage took their bowls without thanks. Some drank immediately, as if the warmth mattered more than the taste. Others held the bowl for a moment, staring into it like it might reveal an answer. I lifted mine and sipped. The liquid was lukewarm and oily, with grit at the bottom that caught between my teeth. It tasted faintly of metal, as though someone had boiled down the city itself, pipes, coins and all, and served it back to us as nourishment. My stomach cramped in protest, but I forced myself to swallow. Hunger is a bureaucratic lever. It moves people more efficiently than threats. Hours blurred. There were no clocks, no windows, only the periodic buzzers marking time like a lash. The room never went dark, but the lumen globes dimmed and brightened in slow cycles that mimicked day and night without granting either. The guards patrolled on catwalks above, boots clenching, their silhouettes passing like the shadows of predators. Occasionally a servo skull drifted by, its Vox grill emitting soft static as it transmitted observations to someone who would never need to see our faces. It was in the night cycle, when the lights dipped and voices softened, that I first heard the restraint collars. At first it was subtle, a faint click, like a clasp being tested. Then another. Then the soft whine of a device powering up. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the underlevels, carried through vents and pipes like a confession traveling through walls. It was not the loud, dramatic clank of chains. It was intimate. The click of a collar being tightened is the sound of someone's future being shortened. The man rocking in the corner stopped, head tilting as if listening to a familiar hymn. "They're fitting them," he murmured. "Fitting what?" I asked, though I already knew. He didn't answer. He just resumed rocking, faster now, the motion scraping his shoulder against the bars. I could hear his breath whistling through his teeth. In the cage across from us, a younger man began to pray aloud. His voice trembled and the words came out tangled and rushed. "Holy Throne, witness me, grant me obedience, let my service be sufficient." His hands clutched a scrap of cloth tied around his wrist, maybe once part of a shrine ribbon. He pressed it to his lips like it could protect him. The broad, shouldered man beside me watched him for a moment, then turned away. "Prayers don't change forms," he muttered, that sentence lodged in me like a shard. Prayers don't change forms. In the hive, everything was forms. Licenses for work shifts, permissions for ration allotments, certificates for marriage, burial, breathing, and now apparently forms for punishment. I realized that the clerks above had not needed to accuse me because accusation was extra labor. A stamp was faster. I began to catalog the smells, like the summary of a file, because inventory gave me something to hold when meaning slipped away. Urine and sweat, sharp, sour, solvent from the pipes, sweet and chemical, burning the nose, mold from the damp corners, earthy rot. The broth, copper and decay. Fear, harder to define, but unmistakable. A cold tang that rose from skin when people stopped pretending. I catalogued sounds too. Quills scratching somewhere unseen. The relentless whisper of bureaucracy continuing even here. The buzzers, boots on catwalks. The servitor's wheels squealing softly as it rolled. The occasional wet cough that sounded like someone drowning slowly. And always under it all, the faint clicks of collars being tested in the dark. At one point, The shouting man in the neighboring cage went quiet. I noticed because silence was rare. He slumped against the bars, head bowed. For a moment I felt relief. Then the guard above leaned over and struck the cage with the butt of his baton. Quiet does not mean compliance. The guard called down, voice amplified through a mask. Stand to attention when addressed. The man tried to stand. His legs buckled. He made a small sound, not a shout this time, but a broken animal noise. The guard struck again and again until the man was upright, trembling. The guard moved on, satisfied, leaving the man standing like a scarecrow. It was then I understood even our suffering had protocols. Even despair had to be properly expressed within acceptable parameters. Silence was suspicious. Hope was disorder. The system wanted us broken, yes, but it wanted us broken neatly. By the time the next buzzer shrieked and the bowls came again, my throat was raw from breathing air that tasted like rust. My wrist, band chafed, the skin beneath it reddened and swollen. I pressed my fingers to the edge of it and felt the tiny needles embedded there, ready to inject compliance if my vitals spiked. I wondered how many men had died in these cages waiting for paperwork to catch up with their bodies. And in the dim, sick light, with the sound of collars clicking somewhere below like teeth, I felt the first true shift inside me. Not acceptance. Acceptance had come with the stamp. This was something colder, the realization that if the Imperium had decided I was guilty, then guilt was simply another label. A function, a box to be checked. I could rage at it, pray at it, argue at the ceiling, or I could endure until endurance failed. I put my bowl down, licked the oily residue from my lips, and whispered my name once under my breath, just once, like a secret I could still keep. Then I stopped, because even that felt dangerous here. They came for us without warning, which was the only warning we were ever given. The lights did not change. The buzzers did not sound their usual cycle. The guards simply appeared on the catwalks above the cages, their boots synchronized with the precision of men who had rehearsed indifference into doctrine. Keys rattled, locks disengaged. Names were not called, numbers were. When my designation echoed through the holding hall, distorted by vox, grill, and disinterest, it took me a moment to realize it meant me. I stood because the others stood, because stillness had become suspect, and because instinct is faster than thought when punishment is close. They bound our wrists with restraint cuffs that hummed faintly, a low vibration that crept into the bones. As they marched us out, I caught one last look at the cages, at the men who remained behind the bars, clutching bowls, clutching prayers, clutching nothing at all. I wondered which of us they envied. The corridor beyond was narrower than the holding hall, its walls bare of icons or inscriptions. No reminders of mercy were needed here. The floor sloped gently upward, and with every step my legs felt heavier, as if gravity itself were invested in my compliance. The trial, if it could be called that, was a corridor, long, straight, brutally well lit. At one end stood a firing line, 3 soldiers in regulation armor, faces hidden behind visors that reflected us back at ourselves. Their rifles were already raised, muzzles aligned with the space we would occupy if we failed to move forward. At the other end stood a lectern bolted to the floor, draped in purity seals and parchment strips that fluttered in the recycled air. Behind it waited an officer in a long coat, the red piping at its edges stark against the grey stone. His cap bore insignia I did not recognize but instinctively feared. Forward. A guard barked. We shuffled into the corridor, cuffs clinking softly. The sound of boots behind us stopped. No retreat was permitted. The officer at the lectern began to speak without preamble, his voice amplified and flattened by vox augmentation. He did not address us as individuals. He did not even address us as men, the authority vested in this office. He intoned, "You have been designated for redemptive service. This designation supersedes all prior classifications, rights, and petitions." The words flowed past me like water over stone. I tried to focus on individual phrases, to catch some loophole hidden in the formal language, but there were none. Bureaucracy is a language designed to eliminate ambiguity, and with it, mercy. He read the oath at machine speed. We were required to repeat each clause when prompted, our voices stumbling to keep up. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy, and each word scraped its way out as if reluctant to be born. The oath spoke of obedience without hesitation, of sacrifice without expectation, of loyalty beyond life. It promised redemption, but never defined it. It demanded faith, but offered no explanation of what that faith would buy. "Do you swear?" the officer said, pausing for the first time, "to serve until release is granted?" We hesitated, just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Behind us, a rifle safety clicked off. The sound was soft, precise, and utterly convincing. We swore. As the final words left our mouths, robed figures emerged from side doors along the corridor. They moved with ritual solemnity, each carrying a metal collar cradled like a sacred relic. The collars were heavy, studded with wiring and small rune plates etched with litanies of compliance. I had heard them before in the underlevels, the faint clicks, the test whines. Seeing them up close made my stomach hollow. These were not restraints meant to hold. They were restraints meant to end. They fitted the collars one by one, starting with the man closest to the firing line. Each fitting was accompanied by a chant, murmured in a language that sounded older than the hive itself. The robed figures moved with reverence, adjusting clasps, checking seals, anointing contact points with oils that smelled of incense and antiseptic. When my turn came, I felt the cold metal settle against my throat, pressing into the hollow beneath my jaw. Fingers tightened the clasp at the back of my neck. There was a brief sting as needles pierced skin, followed by a spreading numbness. The collar hummed, sensing with my vitals, my location, my obedience. I swallowed, and felt the metal move with my throat. The intimacy of it was unbearable. "Sign," the officer said. A small table slid out from the lectern. On it lay a document already half complete, lines of text dense and unforgiving. There was a pen resting beside it, slender, metallic, impersonal. I reached for it instinctively, eager for the familiar weight of something I could control. The officer's hand came down sharply, covering the pen. "No," he said. "Thumbprint." They took my hand and pressed my thumb into an ink pad, then onto the parchment. The ink was cold and sticky, seeping into the lines of my skin. The act felt obscene in its simplicity. A signature would have implied agency, a choice. A thumbprint was just evidence of presence. Proof that flesh had been here. As my thumb lifted, the parchment was whisked away. A seal was pressed into the space beside my print, the wax hissing softly as it cooled. I smelled it, hot resin, faintly sweet, and something in me recoiled. I would come to associate that smell with endings. "Asset secured," someone said. It might have been the officer. It might have been a servitor relaying data to a distant cogitator. The words carried the same weight either way. One of the men beside me, young, with hollow cheeks and eyes too large for his face, began to sob. It was not loud. It was the quiet, broken sound of something collapsing inward. A robed figure turned, lifted a small device, and tapped it against the man's collar. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp gasp as pain lanced through him. He stiffened, eyes wide, then nodded frantically. "Composure is mandatory," the robed figure said, voice calm. We were marched out through a different corridor than the one we had entered. The firing line remained behind us unneeded now. The oath had done its work. My collar felt heavier with each step, a constant reminder that my life had been outsourced to a remote trigger and a line of code. I tried to imagine what it would feel like when it detonated, whether there would be pain or just sudden absence. The uncertainty gnawed at me. As we walked, I noticed small details that felt absurdly important. The way the corridor walls were scuffed at shoulder height, as if countless others had brushed them in passing. The faint smear of dried blood near a drain. The hum of the collar synchronizing with the restraints on my wrists. Institutional cruelty thrives on repetition, and this place bore the marks of long practice. At one point, the young man looked at me, eyes glassy. "They said release," he whispered. "Did you hear that? Release." I did hear it. I had heard it clearly, and I knew, with a certainty that felt heavier than fear, that release was just another undefined term. A future clause, a footnote that could mean anything from survival to summary execution. In the Imperium, hope is often the most efficient leash. "They said serve," I replied, because it was safer than saying what I thought. When we reached the end of the corridor, heavy doors opened onto a processing chamber filled with racks of equipment and more robed figures waiting with clipboards and tools. The air smelled of promethium and disinfectant. Somewhere, machinery clanked rhythmically, preparing for our next transformation. As the guards handed us over, I felt the last illusion of choice drain away. The oath had not bound me to service, it had bound me to expenditure. I was no longer a person being punished. I was a resource being allocated, and as the doors closed behind us, sealing us into the next phase of our unmaking, I understood something with terrible clarity. The Imperium had not asked for my loyalty. It had assumed my disposability. They took us from the oath chamber into open air, and for a moment my senses rebelled. After the recycled staleness of corridors and cages, the muster yards felt violently vast. The sky above was a slab of grey choked with industrial haze, pierced by gantries, cranes, and the slow crawl of cargo lifters hauling crates the size of hab blocks. The light was harsh and unforgiving, reflecting off metal surfaces until my eyes ached. Wind swept through the yard carrying the stink of promethium, wet canvas, and scorched hair, an acrid mix that coated the tongue and clung to the back of the throat. The ground was packed dirt and cracked ferrocrete, churned into mud by boots and trades. Rows of us stood in loose formation, collars humming faintly in unison like a nest of insects. Beyond us, other formations moved with more discipline, uniformed soldiers drilling, officers barking orders, servitors hauling equipment with tireless precision. We were separate, marked. The way people avoid standing too close to a corpse. Strip, came the order, amplified by Vox. There was no privacy, no screens. We undressed under the open sky, fingers numb as we fumbled with clasps and buttons. Clothing was tossed into a heap that a servitor immediately began sorting, separating salvageable fabric from waste. I watched my coat disappear into its grasp and felt a strange pang of loss. It had been threadbare, stained, and mended too many times, but it had been mine. Cold air kissed my skin, raising gooseflesh. The man beside me hesitated, clutching his undershirt like a talisman. A guard noticed. There was a sharp crack as a shock baton made contact. The man gasped and dropped the cloth, hands shaking as he finished undressing. No one spoke. We were learning, still. They marched us to a row of wash stations, metal frames fitted with hoses that sprayed a caustic cleansing fluid. The liquid hit my skin like fire, burning away grime and oils with indiscriminate enthusiasm. I bit down on a cry as it ran into small cuts and abrasions I hadn't noticed before. Around me, men hissed and groaned, some retching as the fumes caught in their lungs. The fluid smelled of harsh chemicals and something medicinal, a scent that promised sterility rather than comfort. Clean flesh honors duty. A robed overseer intoned, pacing behind us as we endured the washing. Impurity is inefficiency. When the hoses shut off, we stood dripping, skin raw and pink. Servitors moved among us with buzzing clippers, shaving hair from scalps, faces, bodies. My head felt suddenly too light, the breeze brushing bare skin that had not felt air in years. Clumps of hair fell into the mud at our feet, dark and matted. Identity reduced to refuse. Next came the brands. They lined us up before a series of metal frames, where glowing sigils burned at the end of articulated arms. The heat radiating from them was intense, a palpable pressure against the skin. I watched the man ahead of me step forward, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on some distant point. Two attendants seized his arms and pressed him against the frame. The branding iron descended. The smell hit first, burning flesh, sharp and nauseating. Then the sound, a wet sizzle followed by a scream that tore itself free before discipline could catch it. The iron lifted, leaving behind a raised, blistering mark etched with unit designation and ownership codes. Blood and plasma wept from the wound. The attendants released him, and he staggered aside, biting his lip until it bled. When it was my turn, I told myself not to scream. I told myself pain was temporary, that endurance mattered. The iron touched my shoulder, and the world narrowed to a point of white agony. It felt as if my bones were ringing, as if the heat had reached my teeth. I tasted copper and bile. I don't know if I screamed. I remember the smell, and the way my knees buckled, and hands holding me upright until it was done. The brand throbbed, a living thing carved into me. I could feel its edges pulse with my heartbeat. Ownership, made permanent. After the branding, they issued us our equipment. A quartermaster stood behind a table stacked with gear, his movements precise, reverent. He recited each item as he handed it over, as if performing a litany. "One rifle, pattern uncertain," he said, placing a battered firearm into my hands. The metal was cold, worn smooth in places by countless grips. "One magazine, capacity reduced. One flak coat, refurbished." I slid into the coat and felt the stiff fabric scrape my skin. Inside the lining, dark stains bloomed like old flowers. Someone else's blood, stitched in place by hurried repairs. It smelled faintly metallic despite the cleaning. "Maintain your equipment," the quartermaster continued. "It is more reliable than you are." I looked around as others were outfitted. Some examined their weapons with a kind of grim appreciation. Others stared at the ground, shoulders slumped. Veterans of other punishments, men with scars that told stories I did not want to hear, walked among us, assessing. Their eyes were flat, professional, the way workers look at scrap metal, gauging whether it can be reforged or should be discarded. One of them stopped in front of me, gaze lingering on my fresh brand. He nodded once as if satisfied with a measurement. "You'll last a charge or two," he said not unkindly. "If you're lucky." Luck. The word sounded foreign. As the day dragged on, the yard grew louder. Engines roared as transports powered up, their exhaust adding new layers to the already oppressive smell. Orders crackled over vox channels, overlapping and contradictory. The sky darkened as clouds thickened, and a fine drizzle began to fall, hissing as it struck hot metal surfaces. They herded us into formation again, collars and wrist bands syncing with a chorus of soft beeps. I could feel the devices communicating, reporting our positions, our heart rates, our compliance. The technology did not care about our pain. It cared about our readiness. By the time the transports loomed before us, hulking shapes of armored steel with open troop bays, I felt hollowed out. The washing, the shaving, the branding, the issuing of gear, it had all been a process of erasure and replacement. Strip away the old, mark the new. Fit the asset for purpose. As we boarded, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a polished metal panel. I barely recognized the person staring back, shaved head, raw skin, brand angry and red against my shoulder, collar snug at my throat, flak coat hanging heavy on my frame. I thought of my name, the one the clerk had mispronounced and then discarded. It felt distant, like something belonging to another life filed under obsolete records. Here, in the muster yards, under the watchful eyes of officers and the impersonal gaze of machines, I understood my new identity fully. Not a citizen, not a criminal, not even a soldier. A replacement, and as the transport doors slammed shut and the engines screamed louder, I braced myself against the wall and waited for whatever line item came next. The transport swallowed us whole, and with it, the last illusion of space. The troop bay was not a room so much as a stacked arrangement of metal coffins, bolted to the inner hull, each compartment just wide enough to curl into a posture of endurance. They called them seating units in the manifests. I called mine a box. The metal was cold despite the heat of the engines, and it smelled of old vomit, recycled air, and fear that had soaked into the seams and never been scrubbed out. I wedged myself inside as ordered, knees pulled to my chest, flak coat creaking as it folded around me. A restraint bar snapped down across my shins with a mechanical click. Another locked over my chest. The collar at my throat hummed in approval, syncing with the transport systems. Somewhere nearby, someone struggled to fit into his compartment, cursing softly until a shock ran through his restraints and silenced him. The transport did not wait for comfort. It sealed us in with practiced speed, metal doors slamming shut one after another until the bay was a mosaic of numbered plates and warning sigils. The engines roared to life with a violence that rattled my teeth. Vibration traveled through the coffin walls and into my bones, a constant, teeth-chattering reminder that I was cargo now. As the transport lifted, my stomach lurched. I tasted bile and swallowed it back, not wanting to add my contribution to the stains already drying beneath the seat. Light came from a narrow slit above my eye level, grated and reinforced. Through it, I could see only grey metal and the occasional flicker of hazard runes scrolling past. There were no windows. There was no sense of direction. Up and down ceased to matter once the engines reached full burn. The universe narrowed to the interior of that coffin, and the sound of machinery doing what it had been designed to do without mercy. Then the sermons began. The loudspeakers crackled, spitting static before a voice forced its way through. It was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Attend," it commanded, and the word vibrated inside my skull. "You are in transit toward redemption. Your compliance is noted. Your disobedience will be corrected." The sermon was a loop, I realized quickly. A recorded litany broadcast on repeat, stitched together from dogma and threat. It spoke of duty as a gift, of suffering as proof of worth, of obedience as the only path to absolution. Between passages, static hissed like a snake, occasionally swallowing entire sentences so that only fragments remained. "Serve without question, flesh is temporary, the emperor protects." The irony did not escape me. Protection was the word they used for a system that had locked me in a metal box and strapped explosives to my throat. Time became difficult to measure. The sermons repeated. The engines never changed pitch. Occasionally, a buzzer sounded and a panel slid open, dispensing water in measured amounts through a tube. I sucked at it gratefully, the liquid tasting faintly of rust and disinfectant. There was food once, compressed nutrient paste forced through a nozzle, thick and tasteless. It sat heavy in my stomach, more obligation than nourishment. At some point, the man in the coffin beside mine began to speak. His voice came through the thin wall, muffled but clear enough. "I had a daughter," he said quietly, as if confessing to a priest. "She used to count the lights in the hab at night. Said it helped her sleep." I closed my eyes, though there was nothing to see. Names felt dangerous here, attachments even more so. The sermons warned against distraction, against clinging to the past. Still, the man spoke, and I listened, because it felt like resistance in miniature. "I was on my way to work when they took me," he continued. "Didn't even let me change out of my boots. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to tell him it didn't matter. That memory was just another thing to be stripped away. Instead, I said nothing. Silence was safer. The collar hummed softly at my throat, monitoring, listening. Hours or days later, someone else began to shout. Not words, just sound raw, panicked noise hammering against the coffin walls. The sermons continued uninterrupted. A warning tone sounded, calm and clinical, insubordination detected. The loudspeaker intoned. Corrective action authorized. There was a pause, then a dull, intimate thump. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. The shouting cut off mid-breath. The transport did not slow. No one screamed in response. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been, thick with understanding. I pressed my head back against the metal and stared at the warning sigils through the grate. My reflection stared back faintly, distorted by scratches and grime. I wondered if the man with the daughter had heard it too, if he was still counting lights in his mind to keep himself steady. The sermons looped again. Redemption through obedience. The phrase repeated until it lost meaning, until it became just another vibration in the metal. I began to drift in and out of shallow sleep, dreams fractured and unpleasant. I dreamed of filing cabinets stretching into infinity, drawers opening to reveal not papers but faces, all stamped with the same seal. I woke with my heart racing, collar tightening slightly in response before relaxing again. Eventually, the vibration changed. The engine's pitch shifted, dropping lower. Gravity returned in stages, pressing me into the coffin with uncomfortable insistence. The transport shuddered as it descended, metal groaning like an old beast settling down to die. The sermons cut off mid-sentence. A new voice came over the loudspeaker. "Live this time. Prepare for disembarkation," it said. "Survivors will be deployed immediately." Survivors, not soldiers, not men. The restraint bars snapped open. The coffin door slid aside with a hiss, releasing stale air and the smell of too many bodies confined too long. I unfolded myself stiffly, muscles screaming in protest. Around me, others did the same, some slower, some not at all. Servitors moved in, unfastening those who had gone still, dragging them away without comment. As we stumbled toward the open ramp, the sky outside glowed a bruised orange, lit by distant fires. I took one last breath of the transport's recycled air, heavy with sermons and static, and stepped out. Whatever waited for us next, I knew one thing with grim certainty: the Imperium had invested in our deaths. The transport had merely been the receipt. They did not give us time to understand where we were. Understanding was a luxury reserved for officers and maps. We were herded down the ramp and straight into a staging trench carved hastily into the earth, its walls reinforced with corrugated plating and prayer scrolls already soaked through by rain and blood. The sky above was the color of a healing bruise, yellowed clouds streaked with black smoke, and the air tasted of ash. Somewhere in the distance, artillery boomed with the steady patience of a metronome, each impact shuddering through the ground and into my feet. The trench stank. Mud churned with chemical runoff clung to my boots, sucking at them with every step. Bodies lay half, buried along the walls, some wrapped in tarps, others exposed where the earth had slumped away. Their uniforms were faded to a uniform gray-brown, indistinguishable from the soil. Forgotten dead, recycled into the landscape. I wondered how long before we joined them, how many forms would need updating when we did. An officer stood on a raised platform at the trench intersection, flanked by guards with pistols drawn. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice carried through the Vox system implanted in our collars, bypassing ears and going straight to bone. "Penal assets," he said. "Advanced directive follows." A schematic flickered across my vision, projected directly into my retinas by the collar. A simplified diagram of a field, arrows indicating forward motion, red zones marked hostile. There was no mention of cover, no mention of retreat. At the bottom of the display, a line scrolled, "Failure to advance will result in immediate correction. Charge when ordered." The officer continued, "Your purpose is to draw fire and exhaust enemy munitions. Any who survive may proceed to secondary objectives. Draw fire, exhaust munitions." I felt something inside me go cold and very still. The system was honest, at least. It did not dress up our function with heroic language. We were ammunition that could scream. The order came without ceremony. A tone sounded in my collar, sharp, insistent. The trench ladder ahead of me was slick with mud and something darker. Men climbed anyway, hands slipping, boots scrambling. When it was my turn, I hesitated just long enough to feel the collar tighten, a warning pulse of pain licking at my nerves. I climbed. The field beyond the trench was a ruin. Churned mud and shattered ferrocrete stretched as far as I could see, pocked with craters filled with file water that reflected the sky like broken mirrors. Shell casings glittered underfoot like teeth. The smell was overwhelming: cordite, ozone, rot, and the unmistakable copper tang of blood. As soon as my boots hit open ground, gunfire erupted. It came from everywhere and nowhere, crackling las bolts searing the air, heavier impacts throwing up sprays of mud and fragments of stone. Men fell around me almost immediately. Some dropped without a sound, holes burned clean through them. Others screamed, clutching limbs that were no longer whole. I ran because everyone ran, because stopping meant pain from behind as surely as death from ahead. Every step felt audited. I could feel the collar tracking my pace, my direction, my compliance. When I stumbled, hands scrabbling in the mud, a jolt surged through my neck, sharp enough to make my vision blur. I surged forward again, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard I was sure the collar would decide it was inefficient and end me. I raised my rifle and fired, because the schematic told me to, because the act felt expected. The weapon kicked weakly, its report lost in the greater din. I did not aim at anything in particular. Targets were shapes in smoke, heat signatures flickering at the edge of perception. Each shot felt less like combat and more like signing another form, acknowledging receipt of orders, acknowledging participation in my own expenditure. A man ahead of me took a hit and spun, arms flailing. He fell face first into the mud, rifle skidding away. I nearly tripped over him. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, rain pooling in their corners. I wondered if his file would be updated before his body cooled. We advanced in waves, though calling it that gave too much shape to the chaos. Groups surged forward until they were cut down, then another group took their place, stepping over the fallen. The ground grew slicker with each meter gained. Somewhere to my left, a cluster of men hesitated, instinct overriding indoctrination. They slowed, bunching up. The correction was immediate. 3 sharp detonations sounded behind us, dull, internal thumps. I did not turn, but I felt the shockwave ripple through the air. The men surged forward again, screams swallowed by gunfire. Discipline restored. I reached a crater and threw myself into it, chest heaving. The water inside was cold and foul, soaking through my flak coat. For a moment, I allowed myself the illusion of cover. Then the collar pulsed, harder this time, a clear directive. Advance. I dragged myself out, fingers numb, and ran again. Somewhere amid the noise, medica servitors moved. I glimpsed them briefly, metallic forms stepping carefully among the fallen, mechadendrites probing, assessing. They ignored the screaming and focused on the quiet, on bodies that still registered faint life signs worth harvesting. They worked with the patience of machines sorting waste, efficient and utterly detached. At one point, I fired until my magazine ran dry. The rifle clicked uselessly. I stared at it in disbelief, as if it had betrayed me personally. A jolt from the collar reminded me that disbelief was not productive. I fumbled for another magazine, fingers slick with mud and blood, and jammed it in. The weapon fired again, indifferent to my feelings. Time lost meaning. The charge was not a moment but a condition. Run, fire, stumble, get up, run again. The field did not change, only our numbers. I realized, dimly, that I was still alive when many others were not, and the thought did not bring relief. It brought dread. Survival meant reassignment. Eventually, the gunfire slackened. Not ceased, never ceased, but thinned, like a storm moving on. An order pulsed through my collar hold position. I collapsed behind a slab of broken concrete, muscles shaking uncontrollably. My breath came in ragged gasps that tasted of smoke and iron. Around me lay bodies in every posture imaginable, some peaceful, some twisted in final agony. The rain washed over them all, making no distinction. I pressed my forehead to the cold concrete and closed my eyes, just for a second, just to block out the sensory assault. In that brief darkness, I felt something like a prayer try to form. It died before it reached my lips. A new schematic flickered into view. Secondary objectives, new arrows, new red zones. I laughed then, a short, broken sound that tore at my throat. It startled me how close hysteria lived to clarity. The Imperium had kept its promise. It had not cared whether I was guilty or innocent. It had cared only that I moved forward when told. As I pushed myself upright, rifle heavy in my hands, I understood something fundamental had shifted. The paperwork had made me expendable. The oath had made me obedient. The muster yards had marked me as property. But this field, this endless, churning grave, had taught me the truth. Survival was not a reward. It was an error to be corrected later. They called us seasoned in the after-action report. I learned the word later when a Vox officer read out casualty ratios with professional satisfaction, his tone suggesting efficiency achieved rather than lives destroyed. Seasoned meant we had endured the first expenditure without fully breaking. It meant the system had miscalculated slightly and was now eager to correct itself. I wore the label like a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. There was no rest. Rest implied recovery, and recovery implied value. We were marched from the field to a temporary staging zone erected among the ruins of what had once been HAB blocks. The structures leaned at unnatural angles, their insides exposed like organs torn from a body. The air here was worse than the open battlefield, thick with chemical residue and the metallic bite of contamination. Warning sigils were painted everywhere in hastily applied yellow, already flaking off the cracked stone. The ground crunched underfoot with powdered glass and bone. An officer addressed us from behind a portable lectern, his boots clean, his gloves spotless. Secondary assignment, he announced. Breach and clearance. Contaminated zone. Resistance expected. Advance regardless. No speech about honor. No mention of victory. Just tasking language stripped down to function. I watched his eyes as he spoke, noting how they slid past us rather than resting on any one face. We were not worth the cognitive effort of recognition. They issued rebreathers next, cheap, single-use masks with filters already yellowed from age. I fitted mine over my mouth and nose, the rubber biting into my skin. The air that came through tasted flat and stale, but it was better than breathing the ruin directly. Others were not so lucky. Supplies ran short, and some men were told to make do. Their coughing began almost immediately, wet and painful. The breach point was a gaping hole in the side of a manufacturing complex, its once proud sigils shattered and blackened by fire. The interior glowed faintly with residual heat, the walls humming as if remembering their old purpose. Radiation counters on our collars ticked softly, a sound that wormed its way into my thoughts. Each tick was a reminder that time here was being measured in damage rather than minutes. We stacked up at the entrance, shoulder to shoulder, weapons raised. The collar pulsed, urging us forward. I hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. The first men through a breach die the fastest. That was not cowardice, it was pattern recognition. The pulse intensified. Pain flared along my neck, sharp and insistent. I moved. Inside, the air was thick and shimmering. Heat distortion warping the edges of my vision. The floor was littered with debris, broken machinery, collapsed walkways, bodies fused to metal by some earlier catastrophe. The smell was indescribable: burned oil, ozone, decay, and something sweet and wrong that made my stomach twist. My boots stuck briefly to the floor before pulling free with a wet sound. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, close and deafening in the enclosed space. Muzzle flashes lit the interior in stuttering bursts, casting grotesque shadows that leapt and vanished. Men fell, their screams amplified by the walls. I fired blindly at movement, recoil jarring my already aching arms. The noise was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against my skull. One of the men ahead of me froze. Just stopped moving, rifle half raised, eyes wide behind his mask. Maybe he saw something I didn't. Maybe his mind simply refused to take another step. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then his collar detonated. The explosion was contained, brutal, efficient. His head vanished in a spray of red and white that splattered the wall behind him. His body collapsed bonelessly, still smoking at the neck. The blast wave slapped my face, hot and wet. I staggered, gagging, vision swimming. No one commented. No one needed to. The lesson was delivered without words. We advanced deeper, stepping over what remained of him. The corridors narrowed, forcing us into single file. The radiation ticks grew faster. My head throbbed, a dull pressure building behind my eyes. I could taste metal even through the rebreather. Somewhere behind me, a man retched and dropped to his knees, vomiting inside his mask until he choked. A servitor dragged him aside without slowing the advance. Resistance came in bursts, sudden ambushes from side passages, traps triggered by pressure plates that blew men apart in confined spaces. Each loss tightened the formation, reduced us to a shrinking knot of silhouettes moving through hell. I stopped counting the dead because the numbers blurred together. Names had never mattered here anyway. At one point, we reached a chamber where the walls glowed faintly, coated in residue that pulsed with sickly light. The heat was intense, sweat pouring down my back despite the flak coat. My collar buzzed, warning indicators flashing at the edge of my vision. I knew what they meant. Exposure levels critical. Recommended withdrawal. The order did not change. Clear the chamber. The Vox barked. We did. How, I'm not entirely sure. I remember flashes, firing until my rifle overheated, hands blistering as I grabbed a fallen weapon, dragging a wounded man behind a slab of machinery, only to feel his collar detonate when his vitals dipped too low. Efficiency demanded it. Mercy was inefficient. When it was over, we stood panting in the glow, bodies slumped against walls, weapons hanging limp in our hands. There were maybe a dozen of us left from the original wave. Our flak coats were stiff with grime and blood, our masks fogged and cracked. Eyes ringed with chemical burns stared out from behind scratched lenses. They called us back then. A short, clipped-ordered extract. Relief flickered, unwanted and dangerous. As we withdrew, radiation ticks slowing, I realized something was wrong. Survival statistics updated in my collar display as we moved. Percentages shifted. A new notation appeared beside my designation: anomaly vivel rati, anomalous. A problem to be solved. Back in the staging zone. The officer regarded us with something like mild curiosity. Fewer losses than projected, he noted. Adjustment required. That was when I understood. We were not being punished anymore. We were being corrected for living too long. The next assignment came immediately, stamped urgent, parameters tightened, higher exposure, narrower margins. The system would not tolerate inefficiency, and survival without authorization was inefficiency of the highest order. As we prepared to move again, I looked at the men around me, what was left of them. Hollow-eyed, coughing, trembling with exhaustion. We had crossed a threshold together, not into heroism but into something colder. We were no longer assets to be spent quickly. We were liabilities that had failed to disappear on schedule. In the quiet moment before the next order, I realized the most terrible truth of all. The Imperium did not punish us to teach. It punished us to demonstrate that it could, and now that we had endured, it would escalate until endurance itself became disobedience. They stopped pretending after that. The final assignment did not come with staging time or fresh equipment, or even the thin comfort of ritual. It arrived as a data, burst-stamped URG-EMT, injected directly into our collars while we stood coughing in the ruins. No officer bothered with a speech. No Vox sermon tried to dress it up as redemption. The language was stripped bare, honest in its cruelty. Objective advance through designated corridor. Assessment, expendable approach, projected losses acceptable. That last phrase echoed louder than the artillery ever had. Acceptable to whom? The question surfaced weakly, already answered by the weight of the collar against my throat. My death had been approved somewhere far above, in an office that smelled of ink and incense, by a clerk who would never know my face. It had been stamped, sealed, and filed long before this moment. They marched us at a faster pace than before. Efficiency demanded it. The corridor ahead was a canyon of collapsed structures and emergency lighting, alarms shrieking intermittently as if the city itself were screaming in protest. Smoke hung low, glowing red where fires still burned beneath the rubble. Every breath through the rebreather tasted scorched and bitter. My boots slipped on ash, slick stone, and each stumble drew a warning pulse from the collar, gentle, almost affectionate, like a reminder from a patient overseer. Around me, the others moved in silence. There was no one left who still talked about home. No prayers whispered this time. We had learned what prayer was worth in the ledger. Faces were gaunt, eyes sunken and rimmed with red. Our flak coats hung heavy with accumulated filth, stiff as armor made from regret. We looked less like men than like walking entries in a casualty report. The corridor narrowed as we advanced, forcing us into a column. The walls were scarred with old impact marks and newer scorch lines. I could see fragments of parchment still clinging to the stone, remnants of warning notices, evacuation orders, devotional texts, burned half away but stubborn in their adhesion. Even in destruction, the Imperium left paperwork behind. The alarms grew louder. My collar display flickered, updating constantly distance to objective, bio, readings of squadmates, loss probability curves shifting as variables changed. I watched one curve spike sharply as the man in front of me stumbled and failed to rise. His vitals flatlined. The display removed his designation a second later, reassigning his projected ammunition expenditure to the rest of us. There it was, the final reduction. Not even a death notification, just a redistribution of resources. Gunfire erupted ahead, heavier this time, overlapping patterns that turned the corridor into a killing lane. The first volley cut down the front ranks instantly. Bodies fell forward, backward, sideways, colliding and collapsing in a tangle of limbs and gear. The air filled with the smell of burned flesh and ionized metal. My ears rang, sound compressing into a dull roar that made everything feel distant and unreal. The order pulsed advance. I did. Of course I did. I stepped over bodies I no longer recognized, fired at flashes of movement, felt impacts thud into my flak coat. Pain flared in my side where something punched through fabric and skin, hot and immediate. I gasped, vision blurring, and felt the collar tighten, not in correction, but in assessment. It was deciding whether I was still worth tracking. As I ran, something strange happened. Not panic, not courage. Clarity. I understood, finally, the full shape of the machine I had been inside all my life. The summons, the cages, the oath, the brands, the transport coffins, the charges and breaches. Each step had not been cruelty layered upon cruelty, but a sequence. A process refined over millennia to convert living citizens into neatly accounted losses. The Imperium did not hate me. Hate required attention. It simply used me. I stumbled again, this time falling hard. The pain in my side blossomed, warm and wet. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the corridor ceiling where emergency lights flickered like failing stars. Around me, boots thundered past as the remaining men surged forward, driven by collars and inevitability. No one stopped. No one could. My collar chimed softly. A calm, almost polite tone. A notification. Vital thresholds approaching. Asset degradation detected. I laughed then, a wet, broken sound that turned into a cough. Blood speckled the inside of my rebreather. Degradation. as if I were a machine wearing out, not a man bleeding to death on cold stone. The alarms faded, replaced by a distant ringing. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. I could no longer feel my fingers. The collar tightened fractionally, preparing. I knew what came next. I had heard it before. The dull, intimate thump. Efficient. Final. In those last seconds I began confessing, not aloud, but inwardly, because there was no one left to hear me. I confessed small things, petty angers, moments of kindness I had almost forgotten. The way I once shared my ration with a neighbor's child. The way I had cursed the administratum under my breath, and thought myself brave for it. None of it mattered. None of it would be recorded. I realized then that the Imperium would not remember me, not as a hero, not as a criminal, not even as a warning. I would be a line crossed out, a statistic adjusted, a form archived and never referenced again. My life had been filed long before I was born. My death was simply the closing of a drawer. The collar's hum rose in pitch. The last thing I smelled was sealing wax, hot, resinous, impossibly out of place, carried on the air from some nearby command post where orders were still being stamped. Somewhere, a clerk would note that the acceptable losses had been met. And then, at last, I was compliant. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter?